one movement, trade unionism, aims to emancipate the free, in Marxist sense, doubly free, right, dispossessed of tools and land and so on, but not bound to a master and therefore free to sell their labor power on the labor market. The doubly free white workers who are now in the mid 19th century, right, very beginnings of industrialization, especially textile mills in the north and other early forms of industrialization. That's the trade union movement. The other labor movement, abolition, is the movement to emancipate Black enslaved men and women working on, not exclusively, but largely on southern plantations, growing cotton. Right away, textile mills, cotton, see the connection? These are two forms of labor imbricated in one social system. You don't get Manchester without Mississippi, without the cheap raw materials that enable the profitable exploitation of the free workers. So there's a sense in which even though these are two labor movements, they are the problems of each, which look very different and indeed are very different, are imbricated in one and the same social system. Okay, and they represent two faces of capitalist labor, politically divided from each other, categorically divided by the color line.
Sorry,
It's okay.
but we don't want real work.
Okay.
Only
imaginary
I'm not
work.
talking about that.
Okay. What I'm doing is not work. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. So two forms of two faces of capitalist labor posed against each other, divided by the color line, and but imbricated functionally in one social system. And Du Bois's whole account, because even though it's an account it starts with slavery, goes through the Civil War, goes through radical reconstruction, which is the attempt under, he calls it actually a dictatorship of the proletariat, because the federal troops are occupying the South and preventing the restoration of white supremacy of the planter rule, at least for a decade or so. And this is a moment of tremendous political creativity in the empowerment and democratic participation and building new institutions. These are the first institutions, by the way, of what much later becomes the US welfare state, the so-called Freedmen's Bureau, which is providing all kinds of social services for the freed people, the freedmen and freed women. Anyway, this is a kind of brief moment of flowering of a kind of democracy, a social democracy. Du Bois calls it an abolition democracy, which gives great benefits not only to the ex-slaves, but also to poor white people in the South. Okay, Du Bois's idea, and then of course the northern commercial. There's a whole question about land reform, because it's not going to go anywhere without that. In the end, doesn't happen. The coalition, cross-class coalition, which includes Northern Capital, that is supporting all this, withdraws the huge compromise. I won't even go into that horrible election. Anyway, the troops are withdrawn, and the next part of the book is counter-revolution of property, restoration of white supremacy, and so on. So the key thing for Du Bois, two labor movements did not recognize each other as fellow labor movements, differently situated, but right with problems that derive from the same single source. did not unite, and so on. And of course, he has some very interesting ideas about why that didn't happen, but I'm going to leave that aside. The claim is that the whole history of the country, and by extension, possibly of the whole capitalist world, might have been different if these two faces of labor had recognized each other and found some way to form a common pro-labor, pro-working class front, which would, I don't think he meant by that they would dissolve their differences into some absolutely homogenous thing, but something like a Gramscian bloc, but that would be centered on labor. So I think this is a very brilliant idea, and I think it remains relevant today because as Du Bois, writing in 1935, and that year is important. It's the year of the CIO, this massive cross-racial labor organizing in the United States, at least in industry, when you do have a real industrial proletariat. But he says that the Black labor was the founding stone of the whole world capitalist economy, and this American slice of it, this enslaved American slice of it, is part of a dark, vast mass, an ocean of expropriated labor, unfree or semi-free labor throughout Asia, Africa, Latin America, the whole world, which is the vast majority of mankind, he says, on whose bent and broken backs rests the whole edifice of the system. And he says, even today in 1935, that remains the case. So after formal abolition of slavery, and it's not, and of course, we do know that there are forms of slavery that exist actually even today, but after formal abolition of slavery, let's say on a mass industrial scale, we still have forms of semi-free, dependent labor, bounded labor, or bonded labor, and it is overwhelmingly racialized. So this idea of the global color line that sort of divides the direct producers, to use Marxian language, into two categories of labor, free and unfree, white or European, and indigenous, people of color, whatever. It still seems to be relevant. We have to only think about sweatshops, brothels, the work that migrants do in the historic core, sometimes without papers, under conditions that are really invite and legitimate, in a sense, abuse or authorize it. So what I'm saying is that I think that the Du Boisian idea is still highly relevant. However, let's raise a question. Why stop at two labor movements? Isn't there also a third face of capitalist labor, equally foundational, another foundational stone of the whole system, equally structural, equally imbricated, equally necessary to the system, namely what feminists call social reproductive work, sometimes care work, we call it, whatever. If that, because we can even go back to slavery and to, if the slaves weren't only producing cotton, female slaves were producing new slaves through rape or other forms of coerced breeding. They were keeping, they were, raising and caring for those children. And this became especially important after the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed in the 1820s. Slavery continues for a number another half a century in many places. In Brazil, until very, very late. I don't remember the exact year. In the US until 65. So the system depends on this reproductive labor, which involves not only breeding and raising and protecting children to the best of compromised ability under those conditions, but also, doing subsistence labor in the slave quarters to feed and, clean and keep something like a life going. Menial service in the planters' homes, caring for their children, cooking their meals, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a blind spot in what is otherwise a brilliant book, and that is a third face of labor. And it's one, of course, that feminists, not necessarily in conversation with Du Bois, although Black feminists have been, have been theorizing and insisting on since Wages for Housework and other early, well, we could go way back to Sylvia Pankhurst, to Alexandra Kollontai, to Friedrich Engels, even, yeah. So, okay. And in any case, it makes sense to me to say that reproductive labor is also a foundation stone, every bit as much as unfree expropriated labor is. And in fact, sometimes they overlap, as in the case I was just elaborating, not always. In which case, I wanted to explore the hypothesis that feminism might be considered a third labor movement, unrecognized by the other two, and to a large extent, even by itself. And that is sort of the controversial part of this. So I call this idea Du Bois +1. And you can sort of see that there would be two faces of it, two tasks of the sort I just at the beginning suggested. First, the analytic diagnostic argument to make the case that reproductive labor is a third imbricated face of labor, along with free exploited wage work and or semi-free expropriated work. And that just as the division between expropriated and exploited labor for Du Bois is articulated along the color line, and in a sense implants racial division, imperial, right, predation, racial oppression, genocidal dispossession, all of these, just as that distinction between those two places implants race very deeply, because that's the mark by which the two faces of labor divide from each other. In the same way, I want to suggest that the distinction between reproductive labor and so-called productive labor, which could include both of the other faces, depending on how we look at it, that division implants a gender binarism very deeply in capitalist society, that is articulated through the gender line, by analogy with the color line. And so we begin to, with this kind of analysis, we begin to get a picture of the, well, first of all, we begin to get the idea that what we might mean by the working class is a pretty big category, and that encompasses all three faces of labor, right? It's not just the first, right, as is usually thought. So that's one interesting idea. Second idea is that gender and race as categories and forms of social division are not exactly alternatives to class, but divisions within it. If all of this is the working class, then we look at how it's divided by gender and race. There might be other divisions as well. I'm not saying anything about white collar work or anything like that, but which I should at some point try to think about. But for now, we get this idea of gender and race, and we begin to at least imagine the hypothesis that something like this organization of labor constitutes the hidden ties. Was the subtitle of my lecture, uncovering the hidden ties between gender and race and class through this analysis of the three faces of capitalist labor. So that's the diagnostic part, the attempt to sort of theorize the social system, and then we come to the sort of practical political part where the social forces. So then the project of Du Bois +1 becomes, or the question, can we envision a common front, a pro-labor front that, right, encompasses not two, but three labor movements, right? Can feminism, anti-racism / anti-imperialism, or migrant rights, or whatever you want to call it, and the deteriorating conditions of those more historically privileged, right, components of the global working class, the unionized, usually white European or American industrial workers who under Fordism managed to become citizen workers, win a family wage in many cases, et cetera, et cetera. Those once privileged groups, but those who are now finding their situation deteriorating greatly. Can these three faces of labor, right, find some way to join together, or at least some portions of those groups find some way to join together in a counter-hegemonic bloc that would embrace and militate for the cause of labor in this broad differentiated sense. Again, not in a way that would homogenize and say, we're all in exactly the same boat, because we are not. Boats are different, but there is something about the system, right, that undergirds all of them, and which suggests, and this was Du Bois' idea with the two labor movements, that that neither the enslaved or ex-enslaved expropriated workers of the American South, the Black workers, nor the free white workers organizing trade unions in the industrial North, neither can emancipate itself alone. That their situations are too imbricated, and that what you get, and which we see historically, is certainly in a country, in countries with large populations of color, if we even think about it from a national point of view, which is not really adequate, we do need to think of it in the larger global frame, but even nationally, the weakening of labor struggles by racial division. This is the whole history of the United States, I can tell you in a nutshell. Maybe less so here, because I don't know your history enough about how much immigration you had and so on and so forth. But certainly in a country like the US, Du Bois firmly believed, and I think he was 100% right, that white workers had much more to gain than to lose by allying with workers whom many of them disdained and wanted only to distinguish themselves from, wanted only to say, I have nothing to do with them. and who perhaps underneath had a great fear of being reduced to a level of degradation that would put them in the same boat of them. And in response to that fear, insisted on their absolute difference, and so on. So Du Bois called that idea the psychological wage. Great idea. That the sense of sort of self-esteem as a compensation. I'm white. Compensation for the absence of the other wage, the real wage for the real work. If we add the third phase of labor, the third possible labor movement, we also have the hard job of thinking, because of all the divisions, not only real misogyny, which certainly exists in the sense of, there's a Jewish prayer, I'm Jewish, that a man says every morning, thank the Lord I was not born a woman. I mean, every religious tradition has this stuff, but that's one that I know. So that's a real sort of like the psychological wage for being a man. Women get a kind of psychological wage, at least some women, in this sort of Victorian sentimentalized idea of social reproductive labor as, some highly moral, put on a pedestal. That is the recognition without the redistribution, right? That's also a certain psychological wage for those women who are put into that category, which is not everyone. Anyway, this is my current project, to think about reproductive labor as a third phase of labor, and as another foundation stone of the whole world capitalist system, of the possible idea of a common labor front that would incorporate these, but now might be thought about as three labor movements. Now, there's immediate objections, and I want to just address a few of those before I stop. So we feminists will wonder, does this hypothesis that feminism is a labor movement obscure a huge range of gender injustices, of male domination, of feminist issues that don't have any obvious relation to labor? Does it downplay concerns about sexuality, about reproductive rights, about gender violence, and even issues that interest non-cis women, gender binarism, et cetera, trans women. So I wanted, my answer is, I don't think so, but I'm not 100% sure. And in order to explore the question, because I don't want to say that everything is somehow reducible to labor. I don't want to be a labor reductionist, okay? And so it's possible that there are things that this view will leave out, but that might still not be an argument against pursuing this strategy, even if it doesn't encompass exactly everything. But what my idea is, let's see how far we can get with it. And to do that, I want to distinguish between forms of sexism that are sort of obviously and directly and transparently connected to labor, versus others whose connections are indirect and harder to see. And then see if there's anything left over after those two categories. That's the strategy. Now, in the first group, things that are obviously connected to labor, okay, I'm not even going to bother with housework and various forms of community subsistence work that might not even be strictly within a private household, but more communal, let's say, or even paid work, whether it's in public social service agencies, in the public sector, or in for-profit nursing homes and other institutions, or in the kind of domestic, very degraded sort of sub work that people who are cleaning other people's houses and so on. Again, often migrants or racialized women. Those are obvious. I'm not going to say that. But I think what should be equally obvious, and again, it's sort of like Du Bois, slavery was a labor movement. Oh yeah. Wouldn't you say the same thing about reproductive rights, the right to abortion? Isn't that obvious that as soon as we expand our conception of labor to encompass social reproduction and care work, we have to think about what it means when women don't control their embodied capacity to produce and reproduce, that they are lacking a fundamental labor right. I think that should be obvious. I know it isn't to everyone, but I believe that should be obvious. Abortion is not generally viewed this way, even by women themselves, which I guess is a strong indication as to how deeply the view that reproduction is not work, how deeply that view is embedded in our ideological, in capitalist ideology. Okay, what about issues raised by Me Too? I don't know what you call that here. I'm sure you have it.
Me too.
Okay.
I say me.
Okay. Again, there should be the famous feminist clique. Probably didn't think of it before as a labor movement, but the second I mention it in this context, what is it about after all but gender abuses of power in workplaces, or in addition in university settings, or medical, sports, and so on and so forth. These are sexual assault, sexual harassment. This is a movement for labor rights to a workplace or a university, which is training for work, as that is free of such abuse. So it seems to me that it is about the right to for women workers, students, athletes, and so on, to participate on a par with others in education, sports, paid work, and to those are now constituted as dangerous spaces in which women are not fully entitled to be present, have to enter at their own risk. So this is a labor right, as far as I can see. One reason I think why that's not often seen is that the media focuses overwhelmingly on stars, on well-known people in entertainment, movies, and so on and so forth, who of course are very famous, privileged, highly paid, and are viewed more as objects of celebrity gossip than as labor activists or as workers, which they nevertheless are. This focus, of course, obscures the prevalence of workplace harassment assault in hotel work, in, remember DSK, on large agribusiness and farm work, in migrant labor camps, in sweatshops, in the private homes that employ au pairs and domestic workers. In terms of sheer numbers, it's overwhelmingly poor and working class women who suffer from these abuses, and especially migrants and women of color, and all of which makes this question of labor central. What about heterosexism, gender binarism, transphobia? Does the focus on labor risk marginalizing or excluding those issues? And of course, they do appear to be very far removed from questions of labor. But a little conceptual digging reveals some connections. As I mentioned just before, this production, reproduction division that is so central implants a deep gender binarism in capitalist societies, and constitutes reproductive work in some cases as a simple expression of maternal feeling or feminine instinct, not real work, assumed to come naturally to women. So care work gets treated almost like a natural resource that's simply there. You don't have to worry about people's energy and time, how to replenish and compensate it, and so on. So all of this implants these characteristics associated, implants this deep gender binarism in capitalist society, I think, and that affects everyone. Women and men, cis and trans, gay, straight, queer. It casts non-cis, non-straight, non-binary people as anomalous, as Butler would say, unintelligible, as outside the pale, which is why it is such an uphill battle for them to win recognition as full members of society. And I think that we can say that those concerns too are connected, at least indirectly, to this system of capitalist labor. That doesn't mean that they don't need to be articulated and become the focus of claims making and so on. But I think we can connect the dots here and say that a labor front has to deal with those things too. That's at least the beginning of an attempt to make some connections between this view of reproductive labor as a third phase of labor, of feminism as an unrecognized labor movement, to existing feminist concerns. There are many more issues that and features of male domination, current forms of male domination that arise, and I've so far really only been talking about Western, European and feminist and Latin American labor movements. Feminist movements as labor movements. This idea is quite strong in Latin America, by the way, where in countries like Argentina and Brazil today, feminism is the face of anti-austerity politics, of the whole anti-neoliberal front. It's all about the assault on social reproduction, and feminists are at the forefront in making lots of connections. It's a kind of feminism that is very expansive and connected and integrative. So I think that this kind of approach already, that's, if I had to point to one place where I can see it, developing, at least as a feminist model, it's there. I haven't said anything about other parts of the world where, of course, there are issues of veiling, and think of Iran, woman, life, freedom, another extraordinary kind of feminism that would take me. I'd have to think about whether and how to connect that to the question of labor. I think it could be done, but I haven't thought it through. Anyway, there are all sorts of questions about other feminist concerns that we should raise and see, again, with the strategy, how far we can get. and at a certain point, we may not be able to get further. But anyway, that's the idea. And so I want to say that for now, I think it is possible to rebut the objection of labor reductionism. I think we can do this without being reductionist. That's the claim. But I'll leave it to you to see if that's plausible. Thank you.
So many thanks, and now I open the floor to comments. I think that Maria Grasso has the first, spontaneously.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy, for all your endeavors, all your precious analyses, notes of, inspiring ideas.
Sorry for the people that looking from the web. Can you come here, please?
Yeah,
Thank you.
where do you want me to come? Where?
Here.
Here?
No, I think
Here.
it's the
Or I
microphone
can
there.
stand?
This
Okay.
round thing is the microphone.
Thank you. So yeah, so thanks for all your precious analyses. So the really powerful idea that I think comes from, what you've been saying is this idea that you cannot have emancipation for one group or one struggle. They need to be interlinked. If we really have to have emancipation, it needs to come from a combination of these different analyses and an understanding of the experience of different groups together. Now, so this takes us to the point which is, today quite common it's a common argument that some might have about the intersections between class, gender, and so forth, and the claim that these experiences are quite unique. So that the intersection, for example, of class and gender, or gender and race, are unique experiences. And so that then leads us to the question of how do we bring these different emancipatory struggles together? What are the bases for really combining them and having a united front, as you say, based on the Gramscian idea? So, in the account of the factory, right? The factory was so special in a sense because it brought all the workers together.
Right.
They realized their own experience, their own exploitation is a common problem. They realized we are the ones creating things, and the alienation of the system is one that is ours, but also society as a whole, and therefore this idea of the working class as the agents of political change. Also with the student movements, you have young people coming together in the universities, in a concentrated space from different backgrounds. And, they came together to challenge different types of outmoded forms of authority. Today, perhaps we have precarization, as well, and other sources of tension. Young women in particular seem to be very progressive in the current moment. So, where does this, how do we tie this all together? Where are these possibilities for the unification of struggles, and where do you see the big hopes for the future? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Shall I? No.
Yes, or there is.
What do you want
I
more
think
questions,
that
or should I? Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. I mean, it's true that everyone thought that because there was this sudden appearance of these huge mega factories, that the physical proximity of workers was a huge, impetus to solidarity, to common action, and so on and so forth. That's true. But we have actually plenty of real world examples of tremendous common action and solidarity that wasn't grounded in the physical proximity in a workplace, in a paid workplace. I mean, I don't know, March 8th here, do you have a big demonstration? There are, I mean, feminism, which is really interesting because at least for those mainly middle-class women who had played such a large role in the movement in the 19th century and early 20th, you know, they were living completely separately, didn't have a paid workplace, but they built something. So I would say that this, and then maybe now we have, you know, the digital capacity to meet together and so on, even when we're not physically proximate. Not that I think that's a full replacement for being in a public square together, but so I don't know. And then we also see, you know, another related argument is the power of the strike at a big Fordist factory to just stop things. This is immense. But look at all these people who managed to bring cities to a big halt by blocking traffic in Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo or wherever, Buenos Aires. I mean, or France, right? You can, you know, drive your trucks there and or whatever it is. So that I wouldn't say that. I think we have to. It takes imagination to figure out how to do this. But I think that there are ways other than work stoppage, although work stoppage remains powerful. The Amazon workers at Staten Island in New York won a great victory through that. And it's it's a distribution versus manufacturing. It wasn't easy to organize and so on. But anyway, with imagination, now that's just at the level of, you know, one movement doing this, one movement doing that. Now the next question is the articulation. Yeah, how to make the counter hegemony. And everybody asked me this question, and of course I don't know the answer. all I can say is maybe if we had a map, an analysis that connects the dots and shows people that they're, even though your problems look like this and your movement is focused on that, that there are these underlying connections, and that none of you alone can do it. You need each other. That is, to say you need each other, you know, is a very almost utilitarian kind of argument, right? And then what I think might be added by the idea of labor here is not just that we need each other, but we actually share something, however different. We are all people who are producing the world and making it run, even though our contributions, the way we do that is quite different. That adds a little more affective glue, maybe. Although I have to acknowledge that it could turn some people off who might say, no, that's not, I'm not that, you know. People, again, might fear labor reductionism and so on, and think about that old industrial model and say, we don't want to go there. We fought very hard to, you know, extricate ourselves from being hegemonized under that. So I understand that that some people will have what I think is a knee-jerk negative reaction, and I want to try to convince them that it's not the right reaction. Anyway, I don't know how to do it. I do think I mentioned woman, life, freedom. Yeah, it's like peace, land, and bread. You know, you need something. you need something like this, but I don't know what it is. But some sort of set of easily understood claims or demands, a very small set that somehow tie it together. We have to think about that.
I have a question of Daniela and somebody, please. Okay.
So, listening your talk, I started to think what Antonio Gramsci would have said. After all, you know. No? Well, I mean, let me say that 50 years ago, I was one of the very young people involved in the republishing of the prison notebooks at the Gramsci Institute, and so I've actually seen the original notebooks. That's can you imagine how can I be touched by the idea that Gramsci is still thought? But I mean, fine. You are arguing too much emphasis was put on the idea of social or political rights compared to what are liberal rights. There is an idea to put together different streams, and fine. We can add feminism to labor movement. We should recognize that often there are conflicting aims, not only between the labor movement associated with race through the normal working class movement. We have seen it and so on. Something similar, of course, will apply if you add reproductive care. There are contradictions, and these contradictions are not just within the capitalist system and the others, but within the family, within the society, and all these sort of things. Otherwise, we make, I think, the mistake to think that a male chauvinistic society, exploitation, or racist society is just associated to capitalism. And of course, we can accept that some of the deep problems of our societies are not just associated with capitalism, but with quite a lot of different forms of society. China too has its own racism within society. So what would have been a Gramscian answer? The Gramscian answer would have been that all these contradictions of different movements would have been moderated, discussed, and somehow sorted out by the modern prince, the political party. Okay? And to what extent do you endorse, even today, the idea that different and conflicting claims need to be associated to a political party? And to provoke you a bit more, do you think that Bernie Sanders would have been the answer in order to organize such a political party which will put together different contradictions, under the assumptions that not all the claims are directed to capitalism? For example, if you look about reproductive care, quite a lot of them should be addressed to the state, to the welfare state, in order to do more, and so on. I will stop here.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. There's a lot, that was a very rich comment, and there are many points that I want to try to take up. Let's see, first of all, let's talk about what Mao famously called contradictions among the people, right? Okay, which is your first point about all the conflicts within what I am calling the broadly conceptualized working class, including men and women in the family. Yeah. Now, there's no question of sort of what would be the word, washing them out of the picture. Those are real, but the point is to try. This might not be a popular idea, but I think that there's a very important step in political thinking that requires a certain decentering from your immediate experience. I know everyone is my experience. But you know, the idea is to understand that those conflicts actually have a certain basis, are encouraged, are somehow, right, implanted in this organization of society that we live in. We live them personally and existentially, and it's not that we can ever, I think, fully, you know, forget that, but we have to also understand their grounds and understand that even as we battle them in our personal lives, we need to address them, the grounds and the causes at another level. And that's what this politics is about. So again, Du Bois. I mean, this idea that white workers had a lot more to gain than to lose by allying with those they disdained. Somehow, look, I grew up in, I'm a 68er. I experienced a mixed sex left long before, right? The sort of, you know, it was, there was sexism, it was, et cetera, but there's got to be some way in which we understand that we have to fight together. We have to. Individual men are not the primary beneficiaries of this system. Individual men who are of the working class, they can behave horribly, violently, and arrogantly, and so on and so forth, but they are not the primary beneficiaries of the system, and they too have more to gain than to lose from something like that. So that's my answer to your first point. Let's see. Your second point. Well, it really depends what you mean when you say that male domination or racism and so on long pre-exist capitalism. They're found in non-capitalist periods and regions and so on. The problem there for me is that we sort of dehistoricize these things. We think that there is a thing called white supremacy that, of course, already we have Han supremacy. I don't think, by the way, that the Chinese issue is exactly race. In it, I mean, since the Chinese were, forcibly dragged into the world system through the opium wars and so on. Okay, but I don't think that racism pre-exists capitalism. There's a big argument about this, and there are really interesting arguments on both sides. But I think that ethnic antagonism is probably a human universal. And of course, there's pre-capitalist slavery, prisoners of war, and so on and so forth, ancient slavery. But none of this is tied until probably 1492, the Spanish impurity of the blood. White Jews could never be converted because there was something in the blood. That's when you get a real racism. And I think it coincides actually with the birth of capitalism. So now gender is different. There is male domination, not in every society actually, but in the overwhelming majority. But to me, it's a mistake to sort of say this is one thing called patriarchy. The important thing is that it's part of the mode of production. You know what I mean? It's a division of labor usually, and a division in authority and prestige and ability to lead, or and so on and so forth. In different rituals in some cases, but it's different in in capitalism. It has a very distinctive form because capitalism is the first society to really institutionally separate reproductive and productive work. That was not the case in the ancient oikos. It was not the case in the medieval village. It was not the case, And so our form, what we have to worry about is our form of male domination. And it is deeply and structurally tied to the structure of capitalism, in my opinion, as an institutional order. So that's that point. Then the question of the party. Well, I'm agnostic. I do think we need a lot more coordination and integration of because we have such a heterogeneity today of potentially emancipatory forces, which some recognize one another and sort of talk abstractly about coalition, but don't really manage to have an idea of what would be the basis of such a coalition. Others are, uninterested in each other, or in some cases even hostile to each other. Some labor unions think that ecological claims are job killers, and we have these kinds of problems, which they don't need to be. So we need a lot more coordination and integration and cooperation. Whether and when and if that takes the form of a party, I don't think I'm in a position to say. It might, and I'm not saying I'm against it. I don't think it should be a Leninist party in the historic sense. I don't know exactly what Gramsci's conception of the party was. I'm sure it had one foot in the Leninist model, but maybe it had some more going on too. But no, I think we have to be open to the possibility that organically a political party or political parties, because we have to think transnationally, of course, some kind of labor international unexpected, I think we have to be open to this idea. And I can tell you about Bernie Sanders. No, I don't think Bernie Sanders was the end all and be all. When he was asked what democratic socialism meant, he frequently said Denmark, which is about the lamest answer I can imagine, especially since Denmark had become this poster child of neoliberalism when he said this. Yeah, so, but he did give us the something like the idea of a left-wing pro-working class or progressive populist, even social democratic, whatever you want to call it. All of these words have some purchase. Some alternative to what became Trumpism on one side, and to the Clintonite progressive neoliberalism on the other side. He staked out the possibility of a third option. It wasn't perfect. Podemos tried to do this. Syriza tried to do this at one point. Jeremy Corbyn tried to do this. Mélenchon in France tried to do this. These are, none of these people are perfect. They're, in some case, old lefty, this and that. There was an attack on Bernie, and I'm not sure exactly where it originated in a feminist idiom. There was a lot of talk about Bernie bros, that this was a male thing, which was completely wrong. And there's always the weaponization of gender and race by those who want to split the front. I co-authored with Eliza Featherstone a Jacobin blog post, why Bernie is the real feminist choice, as opposed to Elizabeth Warren, who was using the gender card at a certain point against him. Anyway, yeah, maybe I'll leave it at that. You had so many points, I don't think I got them all.
So, Charles, please.
First and second.
You guys should join this discussion.
Okay. I want to, first of all, thank all of you, and especially Nancy Fraser, of course, for these very thought-provoking ideas that you're putting forward, and I'm looking forward to read your new book, which I haven't read yet. I actually wanted to follow on Daniele's issue. But first of all, I want to ask you, or ask ourselves also, what we mean by feminism. Is it a social movement? And if it is a social movement, is it only one social movement? We have the example of our current Minister for Equal Opportunity and Motherhood, I think, I don't know how it's called. I mean, she said she's a feminist. And she was a feminist a long time ago. She changed her mind, but she still defines herself as a feminist. And of course, there are many divisions among those who call themselves feminists. Here, but not only here, I think everywhere, not only on single issues, but in the way we look at the word. And I remember, I'm obviously second wave feminist, and in Italy, second wave feminists mostly were middle class. They were white also because there were not many migrants at the time. They were people we were women who went to university, but we also were part of what was called the New Left, right? So in a way, we kept everything together, even when we separated from what was calling itself the New Left or whatever. We separated as a movement, as feminists, whereas, however, many of us stayed in both.
Double militants.
Yeah, double militants, exactly. So I should say that at that point, at least, we had a very wide idea of the word. What we thought, we never thought. Now, there are many feminists who say they want half the share of the pie. We said we wanted a whole completely new pie. So, there are different feminist strengths. And I will also go back to something that Daniela was saying before. Yeah, I think that I don't know about binaries per se, but I haven't been an anthropologist in my old life. I know that not just the division of labor, but also in many societies, not in all societies, but in many societies who were not capitalists or not yet capitalists, women's freedom, women's submission to male authority, not everywhere, but it was there, and may have had to do with the division of labor, or maybe it had not to do with the division of labor. Certainly it predates capitalism. Perhaps, as you say, capitalists made it into institutionalized it. But I, from a sociological point of view and also an anthropological point of view, I consider gender a social institution. That's what it is. And we find it everywhere, differently defined, differently interpreted, but we find it everywhere. The last thing I want to say is perhaps more to Daniele than you. I mean, about the synthesis, the prince, the modern prince, the political party. What I think is one of the main problems of our, I don't know, of all societies, but certainly the society we live in Europe and perhaps in the United States, is that it is a horizontal, flat society. And there are no links between, political institutions per se, and there is no vertical link. There are only, at the most, horizontal links, but no vertical links. we lost those links with the decline of mass political parties, of mass unions, and so on and so forth. We don't have that anymore. Should we reconstruct it? Can we reconstruct it? Do we want to reconstruct it, and why? Sorry.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's really nice to see you and to hear you, as we are of the same generation for sure. So on your point about many feminisms, I completely agree. And the many, there are many, many. Subscribe to is that feminism is really a field of argument as opposed to a a kind of orthodox unanimous ideology. And it's completely understandable that there are as many feminisms as there are distinct political ideologies in a given setting. So in a country like the United States, where the dominant political ideology is liberalism, liberal feminism has been hegemonic, and we didn't do as well as you in Italy did. The difference in political culture. You had a much stronger labor movement, a much stronger socialist or Marxist tradition. So, for us, except in some very exceptional moments like the 1930s and for a while in the 1960s, where people develop a systemic understanding, perfect or not, of how the system works, for the default position is to gravitate to individualism, to the idea that poor people are poor because they're not working hard enough, to the idea that problems are personal, that there is discrimination that blocks our rise up the meritocratic ladder, these kinds of ideas. This is the common sense of the country. And so the second that you come out of a period of the 60s or early 70s, everyone defaults back to that. And we did worse than you did at sustaining a left-wing feminism. So, which, this is why I wrote with Cinzia Ruzza and Tithi Bhattacharya this book, Feminism for the 99%, which in a sense was inspired by Occupy, by Sanders, and so on, by saying, let's get beyond this feminism of the so-called 1%, or maybe it would be more accurate to call it the 10% or whatever, I don't know. So we've had communitarian feminism, liberal feminism. We have Christian feminism. Mm-hmm. This actually reminds me of the other point about what is feminist and what isn't. We have feminists who are quote unquote pro-life. They believe abortion is murder. That's a hard thing. We say they're absolutely not feminists, or do we? And so every religious tradition has its feminists that are trying to rewrite the holy book or the whatever and show that it doesn't have to be patriarchal. Some of that is quite interesting. And then we have, Black feminism, indigenous feminism, and in some cases, this is part of that field of argument. Is your feminism tacitly white or middle class or heterosexist or even racist, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all very important arguments. And so I don't believe that it's a any more than but you have to say the same thing about anti-racism. liberal anti-racism, conservative, neoliberal anti-racism, as well as a more class anti-feminist, pro-feminist, et cetera, green capitalism versus eco-socialism. Every movement is divided, and so for me, and this is really what feminism for the 99% was about. The idea is to try to imagine a counter-hegemonic bloc of the pro 99% or the pro-labor parts of each of those movements. In a some kind of because even though maybe ideologically they're not the majority in each of those movements, in terms of sort of who they represent the majority, if the majority came to understand that themselves in that way. Anyway, that's my answer about that. What was your point to Daniela? I've sort of forgotten already. Just remind-
Parties,
What was it?
on the political parties and the horizontal.
Yeah,
and
the
vertical
horizontal and
ones.
the vertical. Yeah, I think it's very important to distinguish clearly in our minds sort of the end state that we imagine a good society would be, and then the path, the political, how we get there. And of course, there's a huge problem in arguments about anarchism, or is the end contained in the means, and so on and so forth. But I don't believe there's any path that doesn't actually confront power with a counterpower. So this does speak to the question of the vertical. We might in the end want a society that is more horizontal, that has a form of democratic self-organization without a repressive apparatus, and without various centralized forms of hierarchical power in the vertical top. But we can't get there by delinking and forming communes here and there and commoning. The wages for housework in the current form in this commoning, to me, is a romanticism, and I don't want to go there, much as I admire the original work they did. Yeah, I'll leave that to that.
Please.
So, thank you very much for the talk today, and would like to say from.
Can you please introduce yourself first of all?
Yeah. So I'm Carlo Veraldi, and currently work at Queen Mary in London, and hopefully in the next month, so we'll also join the institute here in Rome. So. So first, from the outset, I would like to say that I'm very fond of your work, but I have 3 points that in a way is kind of challenging you on some of the things you said today. So the first one is on this idea of the totality, right? So the fact that we think there is this system, right, that we call capitalism, but in a way can explain the different crises we're going through. And again, I'm very, very much on your side. I think that there is, but I think the really kind of critique that could be done to that, and that probably you briefly mentioned in the talk before, is the one that, for instance, Gibson Graham put forward. So the idea that Gibson Graham, so the idea that we have like certain post-structuralist idea that constructing these sort of monster of capital then for maybe closes other possibilities of change. Then the second point is on more on, like, again, on diversity, or if you want, the point of emancipation. A few years ago, I think you brought a paper engaging with the work of Polanyi called Triple Movement, right? And so my sense is, well, if does exist a system, and we believe that it's capital, so then it might be many mechanisms in which somehow could, survive this kind of movement between, emancipation and class struggle and so on. And the third point, in fact, is on the political real, in a sense. So it's true there is a wealth of works and books that are published today and analysis on capitalism. But on the other hand, if I look at what's happening in the world now and the direction we're going, we see here in Italy a very right-wing movement. Maybe Trump is going to be again the candidate in the United States, and the war and so on. So I see, well, maybe we're not going, in that direction. So after all, as Marx wrote, right, in the Thesis of Feuerbach, the point is to not to interpret the word, but to change it, right? So
Yeah.
again,
Good.
questions being asked before, but how can we do that?
Thank you.
So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I really liked all your points. The totality, first of all, Gibson Graham, very interesting book that argues that that it's basically, let me be sort of provocative. The basic point of the book is that it is Marxists who have created capitalism as this systemic totality. And I want to say, really? You think it wasn't Google? I don't know. I don't think we have that much power to do it. No, look, the problem with that kind of analysis is that they think there are places that are really outside capitalism. It's true that there are lots of places that are not directly through the monetized circuitry, right, fully incorporated, but they are deeply constrained, stamped, shaped, and by that circuitry, and in some cases, dying as a result. I've been referring to Saskia Sassen. Don't you think the expelled and the dead zones have something to do with capitalism? These are, I don't believe there is any outside. And when I say that, I'm not like thinking of something like the Matrix or whatever. It's not that kind of a thing. It's a system that is always incorporating and expelling at the same time. It's not like it's not the kind of totality that takes every look. I mean, one point is to distinguish between the capitalist economy and the capitalist society, right? The society is deeply imbricated with the economy. It's cannibalized by it. It supports it. It sometimes opposes it. Anyway. So I'm not a fan of Gibson Graham, even though I kind of appreciate the creativity and imagination of their work. Polanyi. Well, thank you for mentioning the triple movement, because it now makes me see that I'm always doing the same thing. Polanyi had a double movement, let's have three. Du Bois had two labor movements, let's have three. I mean, what is going on in my head that I'm just doing this? I don't know. It's very strange.
We are three for this reason. I don't
Okay.
It was not.
Excellent.
So, which is which? Which is race? Of the two of you, which is race? Which is?
Yeah. I mean, what I was doing with Polanyi. I mean, he's been a big influence on me, and so now I'm going to use the number 2. I sometimes say that my work is inspired by the 2 Carls. If there's a third Carl, I don't know who it is, but at least 2.
Well, there is the third card.
Yeah.
Could be Carla Ronzini.
Oh, thank you. Excellent. I'm going to think about that one. And anyway, the idea there, which I think was useful in parsing the political field today, and it gets to your point about the pessimism, the bad direction. Polanyi thought that there would as an alternative to the Marxian idea of class struggle, he thought that the real conflict was between the sort of forces that were always trying to extend the market and further monetize and commodify, and those that were resisting it, which could include, you know, Tory landowners as well as trade unionists and so on and so forth. And I thought that that way of writing the history of capitalism had some strange omissions, namely anti-slavery, anti-colonialism, feminism. These were not on pro-market or anti-market exactly. They were some third thing. And what I was able to do with the idea of a triple movement, and say that there's this emancipation, marketization, social protection, was to map these two against one. This is the Gramscian idea again. How do you make the hegemonic bloc? So sometimes you had social democracy, I thought, was a kind of compromise formation, a way of something that maybe Polanyi didn't imagine writing when he was writing, was an alliance of marketization and social protection. But the casualty of that was emancipation. Now, what I think we got in many countries, not everywhere, was an alliance, a equally perverse, more perverse alliance of emancipation and marketization against social protection. And that's liberal feminism, liberal anti-race. That's Obama, you know, which, you know, keep the derivative, keep Wall Street happy while, you know, promoting some kind of liberal feminism or anti-racism. So yeah, so the idea that I had, it's sort of the same idea in the three labor movements, is what if we tried something new? What if you tried to unite emancipation and social protection against, not marketization totally, at least runaway financialization and marketization? I think that this three labor movement idea is sort of another iteration of a similar intention. And then what was your last point again? Oh, how bad things are. Absolutely, very bad. Very bad. When I started this project, it was sort of in the midst of the Sanders possibility. And I think I was more hopeful then. I feel much less hopeful now, because we don't see that possibility, any incarnation of that possibility. We have the idea, but it's not embodied anywhere in the United States, certainly. And but as I said in a meeting yesterday, we have to not get too, you know, caught up in pessimism one day, optimism. You know, it's a volatile situation, things change. I don't believe that Sanders-like possibility, the three labor movement possibility, I don't believe that's simply finished. It surges in different forms at different moments. I think it was somehow in Occupy, it was in Sanders, it was, you know, we will see it again. That doesn't mean it will be victorious. The forces arrayed against it are very powerful. But, you know, all I think I can do as a critical theorist is to throw out some ideas and see who salutes.
I think that Teresa.
I have a question, which is also a comment. Actually, it's the same question I asked you yesterday,
Okay.
but I will try to,
Yeah.
to ask it again, maybe in a more articulated way today. And the question is, which is the scale which is pertinent to think capitalism and to think the counter-hegemonic movement? And I will start with an empirical example and then go back to a theoretical question. You mentioned Syriza, Podemos, Corbyn, and Sanders. Let me leave out Sanders for a second, and let me take Syriza, Corbyn, and Podemos. This was really striking because what happened was that in Europe, these three movements, left-wing movements, that I think tried to do what you said, bringing together these three aspects of social emancipation, they were totally crushed. Just a note, I am really puzzled to see that left-wing movements are crushed by Europe itself,
Yes.
while the right-wing are not. Meloni has a much better life, also has much more respect from the European Commission, the European institutions than Syriza had or than Jeremy Corbyn had. But isn't there also a problem in the way in which Corbyn, Tsipras thought about the counter-hegemonic movement? Europe was a question there, right, for them. But for me, the question of Europe is also the question of the scale, right? Syriza or Corbyn, to me, they thought counter-hegemonic blocs at the national level, at the global level, and these two levels are essential. Of course, we cannot do anything if we don't think globally or even planetary.
Right.
But they failed to see that the real struggle was, for me, on the boundaries of, on the shape of capitalism in Europe.
Right.
Europe, I would reframe Europe as the place or the scale of struggle among different fractions of capitalism. So, and this leads me to a theoretical question, which is the one I tried to ask you yesterday, and this is a bit complex, so I also ask for your patience. And this goes back to what Daniele was saying today and in your Lectio Magistralis at Sapienza. I would frame it again as the question of the scale, but also as the question of the state. And you mentioned democratic socialism. Allow me to go back to another Althuserian, Nikos Poulantzas. He had this book, State Power Socialism, in the 70s, in which he sketches a path towards democratic socialism. And the question of the state for Poulantzas is central because he says that it's the state that in Europe it's turning towards authoritarian statism. So the state is a critical juncture for both promoting capitalist domination and blocking counter-hegemonic processes. So, but I think that we cannot go back to Poulantzas to some extent because he was thinking about the national state, right? So my question would be, when you talk about structure, this entails also, I think, a political structure. But I think we need to think this question that Poulantzas called the state at a different scale, which is national, global, planetary, but also regional or intermediate. Could we bring in
hopefully with a better result? You know? The end of Poulantzas was very unfortunate, as many of you know. But yeah, that's another story.
Could we bring in Foucault's understandings of a physics of power? Could that be close to your way of framing the way in which different sides of the system have effects over one another, which is what Foucault named the physics of power, the force of one element over the other in building the network of domination, and eventually we understand that in understanding the scale and how, at which level we should understand or act for the counter-hegemony.
Right. Thank you. First of all, I usually, at least when I'm conscious enough to write what I really think, I use the phrase public power instead of state, precisely to suggest that the state, the territorial state is one form of public power, but we have public power at many scales, and in some scales it's more public than others, I have to say. We do, even though of course we don't have a world state, there is a lot of public or semi or pseudo public power, some of it articulated through treaties among states, some of it that in the form of sort of transnational governance organizations, some of it now sort of constitutionalized in various courts that adjudicate property disputes and this kind of stuff, and the sort of and then of course we have the EU phenomenon, which was once considered the great avatar of post-national democracy, but as you said, basically drove the Greeks into etc. So I mean, I want to say a couple of things. Public power at many different scales. Historically, the territorial state was the place when public power scaled up from Florentine city-states and so on, through the invention of representation. That was the place in capitalist history where people became used to addressing claims, tried to become citizens, tried to democratize, and so on and so forth. So it makes perfect sense that remains a very important arena of interaction. I think that part of the big question is, where are claims addressed?
Mm-hmm.
And we are still addressing claims to our territorial states, which, and this is the Greek tragedy, which the state, it doesn't have the power actually anymore to address. There's been, I think, a new architectonic of public power that has it basically works to empower mega transnational corporations and global investors, to immunize them from anything resembling democratic state power. I mentioned the TRIPS intellectual property regime, which works that way. A very good book, I hope it's translated into Italian, that I mentioned, I think yesterday, is Quinn Slobodian, The Globalists, a very good book that really traces the architecture of this. So Europe is, I don't know, would I be fair or to say you guys know much more about it than me? You live with it. The European Organization of Public Power is mainly an agent of neoliberalization for the most part, with some other sort of social justice window dressing. Is that too severe? I don't know. Anyway, I think that that this is all complicated by the fact that the sort of territorial state imaginary, which is the Westphalian imaginary, is actually, and has always been from the beginning of capitalism, overlaid with another architecture, which is in global imperialism. Okay, so that's the unofficial map of power and public power. And of course, we still have this wealth drain from the global south to the global north, through especially the mechanics of debt. And that's a huge focus of organizing in the global south, including feminist organizing and so on. So somehow, I don't think the Poulantzas model is, for whatever, not only because of this, the end of his life, but I don't think it's up to date. It's highly intelligent for when it was done, but the levels of public power, the ways in which some overdetermine others and weaken others, whether that's physics of power, I don't know. But that's sort of how I see the problem today. So what, and the only other point is that what the conclusion I draw is the necessity to organize simultaneously at different levels.
Yeah.
That's the obvious thing. We can't abandon the state arena. It's so important. But, you know, how the sort of Seattle alter globalization movement was very important. The Zapotec movement, very important.
Right.
Exactly. You had Genoa, we had Seattle. This was very important at revealing something about this, the global aspect of this architecture attack in France. So these things have to go together, organized at the European level, at this global level, at the national, and of course at the level of the city, smaller units too, very important.
So I think that everybody is angry here. I really thank you. It was a fantastic conversation, and have a good lunch. I'm not good at conclusion.